Hi everyone and happy Wax on Wednesdays. As promised, some more with cold wax painting today, and I kind of decided just to do a summer cold wax series. Something a little bit fun and different and change it up a little bit here on Wax on Wednesdays. So here I'm just adding some R&F encaustic gesso to Arches oil paper. And it looks just like the watercolor paper, but this is 140-pound Arches paper for oil paints. And I like to leave a little bit of texture. And here I'm adding oil paints to my cold wax, and I'm using the Gamblin again this week. You can use Gamblin or Dorland's or make your own in your own studio. And it doesn't matter really what brand of oil paints, just use the best paints always that you can afford. And this is, I'm putting a little bit of cold wax by each little bit of oil paint there, and then I'm going to go ahead and add in some Gamblin Galkid medium. And the great thing about the Gamblin cold wax is that you can mix the whole sort of family of solvents in with your cold wax medium. So the Galkid medium, it helps the dry time, and it also helps the gloss a little bit. When you're using cold wax, it's very matte, and it's taking all the sheen out of your oil paints as well. So the Galkid sort of adds a little bit of sheen, not a lot, but a tiny bit of luster back in to your paints, and it also helps it dry a little bit harder. And there's also a Galkid gel that is a little bit thicker, so if you don't want to thin your wax medium and oil paint down that much, then there's also a gel that you can use so it'll keep it quite a bit thicker. And here I'm just adding it directly to the paper. I'm just beginning adding some paints, and the fun with cold wax is always the layers that you can achieve. And this is just basically an underpainting and getting started with getting some colors down on the paper. I'm using a catalyst wedge to do this, and you've seen me use the catalyst wedge many times before, but it's especially fun with cold wax. And any of the catalyst wedges or blades are really good for spreading and digging back in and making some marks in that cold wax medium. And today I'm mostly doing a wet on wet here, wet on wet painting. So you want to be careful not to, of course, make mud. But it's really fun to just sort of play with the color and blending, and this catalyst blade works really well for that, for blending the colors in, as long as you're careful of what colors that you are adding, because you can definitely make mud at this stage. So unlike hot wax or encaustic, which is once it's solidified, your color is sort of stationary there on your piece, and you can add layers over it and dig back into it, but you can't sort of blend it right there on your encaustic paint right there on the surface. And that's sort of the fun with cold wax, is you can continue wet on wet to blend these colors, and one on top of the other. As long as you're careful about the mud situation, then you can continue to just blend, and it's very creamy, very buttery, and add several layers just wet on wet. And the other thing is digging back into previous layers. So that first layer that I laid down that the paper absorbed in that paint, I can always scrape back to that initial layer, and that's using several different tools. And this is, of course, one of the spatulas, and I can dig back to that really lovely translucent yellow layer. And I can use several tools to go ahead and apply paint back on or take it off. So I have a couple of different spatulas, and then of course my catalyst wedge here that I'm digging back in some lines. And at this stage it's so wet that I can cover it back up. I can draw back in. You can really sort of play with it any way that you want. And here I'm adding some lines with the catalyst wedge, wet on wet. And if that dries, it has a really impasto feel to it. And there I'm drawing back in, and that little line will have some texture again when it dries. And here with the spatulas, I'm just scribbling in, and that's a great thing as well. When that dries, it'll have a um, nice effect to it, and you can continue. This is just an old card, hotel key card that I'm using to scrape back into that first layer again and add some more marks. So now these pieces have dried for several hours or even maybe overnight, and I'm going ahead and very gently adding in some layers over the top of them. So it's no longer as wet as it was, but it's not completely dry either. So if it was completely dry, I could really dig into that previous layer of paint and really go over it with no worries about it smudging. This I'm going over very lightly because I want to retain that texture that I scratched in with different tools. I want to retain some of that lovely texture. So I'm just going over it really lightly with some other colors, but I don't have any fear of really making any mud anymore as long as I'm going over it very lightly. I can add all new layers to these pieces and let the previous layers here and there show through. And that is what makes cold wax so sort of really cool, is that you can let little bits and pieces of previous layers shine through. You can scratch back to all of those layers as it dries, and you can continue to really build with numerous layers in different stages of dry time. And next week, I will show you how to really scratch back into previously dried layers of wax and continue to build on those layers. And now I'm just removing the painter's tape from my pieces, and this is one of the most satisfying parts for me, seeing the reveal of these little cold wax pieces, art pieces on paper. So I hope you enjoyed a few things that you can do wet on wet with cold wax, and I hope you stay with me this summer for the rest of the cold wax series. Have fun and happy Wax on Wednesdays.